Helping everyone financially is not a sign of wisdom, it is often the quiet beginning of poverty. Most people never see it happening, because the thing draining their stability is the same thing they were told to be proud of. King Solomon, one of the wealthiest and most studied minds in ancient history, understood something about generosity that almost no one teaches today. That kindness without structure does not protect people, it slowly dismantles them. The Book of Proverbs does not warn against laziness alone, it warns, repeatedly, against the absence of preservation. There is a difference between a generous person and a disciplined steward, and that difference, practiced quietly across decades, determines everything. If this challenges you, stay until the end. There is a particular kind of financial exhaustion that no one talks about honestly. It does not come from reckless spending. It does not come from bad investments or poor career decisions. It arrives quietly, gradually, through something that most people consider a virtue. It arrives through generosity. Consider this carefully. A person spends years building discipline. They save consistently. They live below their means. They avoid unnecessary purchases. By every visible standard, they are doing everything correctly. And yet, after a decade of this discipline, they look at their reserves and find almost nothing remaining. Not because they failed, but because they said yes, repeatedly, consistently, without structure, to everyone around them who needed financial help. This is not a rare story. It is one of the most common financial patterns of our time, and almost no one frames it correctly. The assumption most people carry is simple. Helping others financially is a sign of wisdom, strength, and responsibility. If you are capable of helping, you should help. If someone close to you is struggling, refusing feels like selfishness. Saying no feels like a moral failure. But the wisdom preserved in the Book of Proverbs does not agree with this assumption. And the pattern of ancient disciplined households tells a very different story. Today, we are going to examine that story carefully. Not emotionally, not with guilt or judgment toward anyone, but with the calm clarity that comes from understanding a principle that disciplined families across generations quietly practiced and that most people today have never been taught. The modern world has a specific relationship with generosity. It is one of performance. Generosity is visible, it is praised, it is shared. People post about it. Families talk about who helped whom. Communities keep quiet records of who showed up financially and who did not. And within these invisible social structures, a quiet tax is imposed on those who are perceived as stable enough to pay it. Think about the salaried worker. Perhaps you know one. Perhaps you are one. They earn a reliable income. They budget carefully. They build a modest but growing reserve over time. And slowly, reliably, they become the person in their family circle, their friend group, their immediate community, who is called upon whenever someone else faces a financial difficulty. The first request feels natural. Of course, they help. They can. The second request comes quickly after. The third follows before the second is resolved. And within a few years, this person has quietly transformed into a financial safety net, not for their own future, but for the undisciplined behavior of people around them. No one intended for this to happen. There was no conspiracy. There was no exploitation in the dramatic sense. What happened was structural. A disciplined person, operating without financial boundaries, was slowly converted into a resource for everyone except themselves. If generosity alone created stability, this would not be a problem. If the act of giving reliably returned more than it distributed, the most generous people would also be the most financially secure. But look around honestly. That is not what the pattern shows. The most financially exhausted people are often also the most financially generous. And the most structurally stable households are often the ones who give the least, visibly, and the most quietly, and always within limits they have already decided. This is the first disruption, and it deserves to sit for a moment before we move forward. King Solomon, regarded across ancient tradition as among the wisest figures in recorded history, accumulated not only immense wealth, but a comprehensive understanding of how wealth behaves over time. The insights preserved in the Book of Proverbs are not inspirational sayings collected for comfort. They are structural observations, the kind that come from watching households thrive and collapse across generations. One of the consistent threads woven through Proverbs is this: the wise preserve. The wise accumulate with patience, protect what they build, and distribute only from a position of secured abundance, never from a position of pressure. Proverbs 21:20 speaks directly to this. There is precious treasure in the dwelling of the wise, while the foolish person swallows it up. The language is deliberate. The treasure remains. It is not exhausted. It is not redistributed until nothing remains. It is preserved in the dwelling, meaning within the structure of the household, by the decision of the wise. Ancient households understood this clearly. Wealth was not viewed as a measure of what you could spend or give. It was viewed as the structural foundation that protected a household across unpredictable seasons. A merchant did not give from his trading capital. A farming household did not distribute grain reserves before the winter had passed. Stability was not accidental. It was the result of decisions made before emotional pressure arrived. This is not a philosophy of selfishness. It is a philosophy of stewardship. And the distinction between those two things is exactly where most modern thinking goes wrong. Here is the assumption that almost no one questions. Most people believe that setting financial boundaries, saying no to requests for help, refusing to lend, declining to give beyond a certain limit is fundamentally selfish. The belief is that those with resources have an obligation without limit to those without, that generosity is a moral requirement, and that restraint is a moral failure. The Book of Proverbs does not operate from this assumption, and the ancient disciplined household did not either. Consider two households. They are neighbors. They earn similar incomes. They face similar pressures and social expectations. But they make different decisions. The first household says yes to every financial request that arrives. A family member is short on rent. Yes, a friend needs a loan. Yes, a relative is facing an emergency. Yes, again. Each individual decision feels reasonable. Each act of help feels like the right thing to do. But across 5 years, across 10 years, the reserves of this household have quietly disappeared. Not through any single large decision, through the accumulation of small ones made without structure. The second household sets a different precedent early. They help when they can, but they have already decided, before any request arrives, what portion of their resources is available for distribution and what portion is permanently protected. They are not unkind, they are not cold, but they operate from a structure, not a feeling. After 10 years, the difference between these two households is not income, it is reserves. It is stability. It is the quiet security that comes from having protected something consistently over time. This difference is not about compassion. The first household was deeply compassionate. The difference is structural. And structure, as the ancient household understood, is what allows generosity to continue without destroying the one who gives. This brings us to the principle at the center of everything we are building today: the reserved capital law. This is not a term you will find printed in a modern financial textbook, but it describes a practice that disciplined households across generations quietly understood and followed. The principle is this: a household never distributes financial resources that have not first been permanently secured for its own long-term stability. Resources are divided into two categories. The first category is protected. It is the reserve, the foundation. It is not available for lending, gifting, or emotional redistribution. It is not touched by requests, no matter how urgent those requests feel. This capital is reserved, and it remains reserved. The second category is distributable. It is what remains after the reserve has been secured. It is the portion from which generosity is permitted to operate. It is smaller, it is bounded, but it is real. And because it is bounded, generosity from this category can be sustained indefinitely without threatening the stability of the household. The ancient merchant understood this intuitively. Before engaging in trade, he set aside capital that would not enter the transaction. Before the season of distribution, he secured the stores that would carry his household through uncertainty. Generosity was not forbidden. It was simply moved to a designated space, and that space had edges. The wisdom of this structure is not immediately visible. In the short term, the household that reserves capital appears less generous than the one that gives freely. But the wise do not evaluate decisions by short-term appearance. They evaluate by long-term outcome. And the long-term outcome of the reserved capital law is this: the household remains standing. Decade after decade, across pressure and unpredictable seasons, it remains standing. There is one more layer to this that requires attention before we go deeper. Most people who experience financial exhaustion from helping others do not identify themselves as financially reckless. They do not see themselves as undisciplined. In fact, many of them are among the most conscientious financial thinkers in their social circles. They save, they plan, they avoid unnecessary spending. But there is a distinction that ancient disciplined thinking draws very clearly, a distinction between two very different financial identities. The first is the emotional helper. This person is responsive. They evaluate financial requests based on the emotion present in the moment. They feel the urgency of the person asking. They weigh their own discomfort at saying no. They help because not helping feels worse. And they repeat this pattern until the reserves are gone. The second is the disciplined steward. This person has already made decisions before the request arrives. They are not cold. They are not indifferent to the struggle of others. But they operate from a structure that was established in a calm moment, not in response to pressure. They help consistently, but only from the designated space. The reserve is never touched. The financial exhaustion that drains responsible people is almost always the result of identity confusion. A disciplined steward, operating without a structural framework, gradually becomes an emotional helper by default. Not because their values changed, because their structure was absent. Recognizing which identity you have been operating from is not a judgment. It is information. And this recognition.com, honest and clear, is exactly where the reserved capital law begins to take hold. The steward does not stop helping. The wise do not remove generosity from their household, but they decide, with precision and deliberate thought, from where help is allowed to come. This is the first layer, and it changes everything about how the second layer lands. There is something that disciplined households understood about human behavior that most financial conversations never address. Boundaries do not only protect the one who sets them, they quietly reshape the behavior of everyone around them. When a household is known, not publicly announced, but simply known through consistent pattern, to always say yes, the requests do not slow down, they accelerate, because the person who always helps has trained the people around them to expect help. The availability has become an assumption, and assumptions, once established, are rarely questioned until they are disrupted. Now consider the opposite. A household that has always operated from quiet, consistent limits. Not harshly, not with explanation or announcement. Simply with calm, predictable structure. Requests that arrive are met thoughtfully, sometimes with assistance, sometimes with redirection, sometimes with a quiet but firm no. And over time, something significant happens. The volume of requests decreases, not because people stopped caring, but because the expectations shifted. The household was no longer seen as an available resource without limits. It was seen as something slightly harder to define, structured, considered, measured, and people, intuitively, recalibrate their expectations around that. This is the hidden lever of the reserved capital law. It is not only a financial mechanism, it is a social one. The protection of reserves does not just preserve wealth, it gradually reshapes the social landscape around the household. It trains the surrounding environment without confrontation, without hostility to interact with the household differently. Ancient households understood this clearly. Stability is often protected not by wealth itself, but by predictable boundaries. A merchant known for disciplined limits attracted different relationships than a merchant known for open-handed generosity. The disciplined merchant was respected. His reserves were not tested repeatedly. His word on financial matters carried weight, because his financial behavior was consistent. The wise preserve before they distribute, and those who preserve consistently are treated, over time, with a different kind of regard. Now comes the moment that tests everything. Understanding a principle intellectually is one thing. Operating from it when emotional pressure arrives is another thing entirely. The reserved capital law does not reveal its difficulty in calm moments. It reveals it in the specific moment when someone close to you is genuinely struggling, and you have the capacity to help, but doing so would require moving resources from a protected reserve. This is the discipline test, and it is where most structurally sound intentions collapse. The emotion present in that moment is real. The struggle of the other person is real. The discomfort of saying no, or saying only this much and no more, is real. None of these things should be minimized. They are genuine, and the ancient disciplined household did not pretend otherwise. But the Proverbs tradition carries a consistent and sober observation. The person who depletes their reserves in emotional response to immediate need will eventually have nothing left to give, not only to others, but to themselves. The foundation, once consumed, cannot generate stability. And a household without a stable foundation cannot help anyone across the long seasons of life. Proverbs 27-12 frames it with quiet precision. The prudent see danger and take cover, but the simple keep going and suffer for it. The danger spoken of here is not always external. Sometimes the danger is internal, the impulse toward immediate response that bypasses the structural thinking a household depends on. The disciplined steward is not unmoved by the request. The disciplined steward is simply operating from a decision that was already made, in a calm moment, from clear thinking, without the pressure of an urgent appeal. That earlier decision is what holds. Quiet households build lasting wealth, not because they are cold, because they are prepared. The decision was made before the emotion arrived, and that sequence, structure first, emotion second, is what separates the household that endures from the one that exhausts itself in goodwill. There is a particular idea that has become deeply embedded in modern financial thinking. It goes something like this. If you are not financially secure, the answer is to earn more. Work harder. Add income streams. Increase the flow coming in. This is not entirely wrong, but it misses something fundamental. And the missing piece is exactly what ancient disciplined thinking has always understood. Without structural discipline, higher income does not produce greater stability. It produces greater obligation. Consider the salaried worker who receives a significant raise. The people around them notice. Not always consciously, but the expectation quietly shifts. The requests that arrive become slightly larger. The assumption that they can help becomes slightly more confident. And within a short period, the additional income has been absorbed, not by reckless spending, but by an expanded network of financial obligations that grew to meet the new level of perceived abundance. This pattern repeats across income levels with remarkable consistency. It is not unique to one culture, one background, or one economic class. It is structural. When reserves are not protected first, additional resources are redistributed outward by social gravity, quietly, predictably, without anyone intending it. The ancient household did not solve this problem by earning more. It solved it by establishing the reserved category before income arrived and keeping it structurally separate from everything that could claim it. The reserve was not available for negotiation, regardless of what the income level was. The discipline of preservation was not dependent on abundance. It was a prior decision. Wealth is not created by effort alone. It is preserved by structure. And structure must precede distribution, always. This is not a secondary consideration. It is the foundation the entire principle rests upon. We have moved through several layers of this now. The disruption, the ancient authority, the mechanism, the hidden social lever, the discipline test. But there is one final shift that matters more than any of the others. It is not a financial shift. It is an identity shift. The reserve capital law is not ultimately about money. It is about who you decide to be in relation to money and who you allow yourself to become under pressure. The emotional helper has a specific identity. They are the one who helps. It is part of how they understand themselves and part of how the people around them understand them. That identity feels good. It is affirmed socially, it is praised quietly, and it is precisely this affirmation that makes it so structurally dangerous. Because when an identity is tied to a behavior, when being generous is part of who you believe you are, then refusing to be generous, even strategically, even temporarily, even wisely, feels like a loss of self. It feels like becoming someone you do not want to be. And so the behavior continues, even when the structure is collapsing. The disciplined steward carries a different identity. Their sense of self is not tied to what they give, it is tied to what they preserve. To the quiet, steady growth of a reserve that makes genuine, sustainable generosity possible across decades, not just weeks. They help, but from a position of decided structure, not emotional response. And because their identity is rooted in stewardship rather than performance, they do not feel diminished by the word no. This reframe is not minor. It is the entire architecture of financial transformation. You do not change your financial outcome by learning a new tactic. You change it by becoming a different kind of financial thinker. The tactic follows the identity. The discipline follows the identity. And the outcomes, quiet, patient, unmistakable over time, follow the discipline. Ancient households understood this clearly. Stability is not accidental. It is the expression of a consistent identity maintained over many years. Every principle, no matter how clearly understood, requires a point of daily contact. Without that, understanding remains abstract and behavior remains unchanged. The daily practice that reinforces the reserved capital law is simple. It asks only one thing, a pause, before agreeing to any financial assistance, before saying yes to a loan, a gift, a bailout, a repeated small contribution. Pause. And in that pause, ask one question honestly. Does this response come from my reserved capital or from emotional pressure? That is the entire ritual. It requires no calculation, it requires no spreadsheet. It requires only the habit of honest self-examination in the moment before the decision is made. If the answer is that the help comes from the designated distributable portion, from resources that were already intended for this kind of generosity, then the decision is structurally sound. Help freely from that space. If the answer is that the response comes from emotional pressure, from the discomfort of saying no, from the desire to be seen as generous, from the urgency of the moment overriding prior structure, then the answer must be reconsidered before it is given. This pause, practiced consistently, gradually becomes automatic. The structure begins to govern the response rather than the emotion. And over months, over years, the household that practices this small discipline looks entirely different from the one that does not in its values, but in its stability. Wisdom begins with preservation, and preservation begins with a moment of honest reflection before the decision moves. One quiet warning before we close. This principle will not feel rewarding immediately. The early months of operating from the reserved capital law often feel uncomfortable. The first no is difficult. The second carries its own weight. The people around a household adjusting its financial behavior will notice, and some will respond with confusion, or quiet disappointment, or mild pressure to return to the previous pattern. This is expected. This is the test. The future must be protected first, not because the present does not matter, but because a household that exhausts itself in the present cannot serve anyone in the future. The discomfort of adjustment is temporary. The structural stability that follows is not. Ancient households did not build lasting wealth in a season. They built it across decades of quiet, consistent, unremarkable decisions. No single decision looked extraordinary. The accumulation of those decisions across time, that is what became extraordinary. Patience is not passive. It is the disciplined act of protecting the foundation while everything around you calls for immediate response. The wise do not abandon structure under pressure. They trust the structure precisely because pressure is present. And so we return to where all of this begins. Not with tactics, not with income strategies, not with a new way to earn or spend, but with a question about identity. Who are you in relation to your resources? Are you the one who distributes under pressure? Or are you the steward who preserves with intention and gives from a designated, protected space? King Solomon's wisdom, preserved across centuries in the Book of Proverbs, does not promise comfort. It promises something more durable. It promises the quiet, stable kind of life that comes from making structured decisions consistently, even when emotion argues for something different. Even when generosity feels easier than preservation. Even when the short-term discomfort of a boundary feels heavier than the long-term security it creates. The wise preserve their foundation first, because generosity without structure cannot endure. And a household that cannot endure cannot give to anyone, not now, and not across the seasons that are still coming. This is not the end of generosity. It is the beginning of generosity that lasts. Structure protects kindness. Discipline precedes generosity, and the quiet household that understands this will still be standing when others have long exhausted what they were given. The future must be protected first, and now, you understand why. The wise preserve before they distribute. Proverbs, tradition.